Hey, what is going on, everybody? Welcome into my latest video. As I promised from my last video, I am going to be continuing my tiers series. This video will be on the running back position, where I've broken down these running backs into tiers. And just like I talked about in my quarterback video, in case you have not watched that yet, these are broken into tiers. These aren't exactly rankings. These are just how I view the players going into the fantasy football season. Now, when I unveil these tier lists, and when you see those players in order, that's kind of how I view them as far as how I would draft those players if they're available on the board when I am up on my drafts in the coming weeks. With that being said, let's just go ahead and dive into this video. My first tier is basically running backs I feel safe drafting as my RB1. These are guys that I will draft. They'll be in that RB1 slot, and I don't have to worry about taking them out of that lineup unless they are unfortunately injured or if there is some severe drop off in their performance on the field. With that being said, running backs I feel safe as my RB1. I think you guys would understand most of these names. Saquon Barkley, Derrick Henry, Christian McCaffrey, Jonathan Taylor, Josh Jacobs, and Jahmyr Gibbs, as well as Bijan Robinson. Just like in my quarterback video, I do have stats here for some of these running backs on my tier list, where they are like one of two, one of three, or four players since 2022 in regular season games that stood out in these certain stats that I did some research over the past month and a half. With that being said, diving into these players that popped up on some stats I found over the last month. Saquon Barkley, he is one of the only four running backs in the NFL with at least 15 regular season games where they finished with at least 75 plus rushing yards and a touchdown since 2022. Derrick Henry is also one of those four running backs as well. As far as Christian McCaffrey, he's one of only four running backs in the NFL who has at least, and this, keep in mind, Christian McCaffrey basically didn't play all last year, right? Christian McCaffrey is still one of only four running backs in the NFL who have at least 2,300 rushing yards and 1,100 receiving yards in the regular season since 2022. And then this is a minimum of 17 regular season starts. So since 2022, so the running backs to qualify for this stat, they had at least to play a full regular season. He's one of three running backs that average over 55 rushing yards per game and 30 receiving yards per game. As far as Jonathan Taylor, he's a guy that's dealt with injuries over the last couple of years, and he still popped up on some stats. One thing that's actually carrying over from last season is Jonathan Taylor is one of two running backs that have an active streak of at least 5 regular season games in a row of having at least 70 rushing yards. And then he is also one of those four running backs that in the NFL that have at least 15 regular season games where they finished with at least 75 plus rushing yards and a touchdown since 2022. Josh Jacobs doesn't have a stat that he popped up, but we saw what he did last year in Green Bay in his first year. I don't really view any of the backup options are going to cut into his touches, so he's going to be that bell cow for Green Bay. So that's why I do definitely feel comfortable with him. And then Jahmyr Gibbs, I know David Montgomery is there, but I do think he's going to end up taking majority of the touches this season. I think he has a potential to very explode. He could very possible finish as the RB1 this year. With that being said, now for this stat, there are some qualifiers. He is one of two running backs that average over 5 yards per carry. That's a minimum of 300 attempts, and he also averages over 5 yards per reception. That's a minimum of 100 receptions in the regular season since 2022. And lastly, Bijan Robinson. I think this is the year that he's really going to explode. Another young running back that's in this tier that I could see finishing as the RB1 by the end of the season, and he's with Jonathan Taylor. He's one of the two running backs that are going to enter this regular season that have an active streak of at least 5 regular season games where he finished with at least 70 rushing yards. So yeah, that's that tier. The next tier of players, these are running backs that I'd take a shot as my RB1 tier. So what does that mean? That means if I missed out on any of the players I just spoke about, and I still have not drafted my RB1 yet, These are guys I would actually take a shot as my RB1 and see how it plays out, because I do think they have a potential to finish as a top 5 fantasy running back if all goes well with them. These four running backs are Devin Achane, Bucky Irving, Chase Brown, and James Cook. Devin Achane, he's with Jahmyr Gibbs on that stat. He's one of the two. He's one of only two running backs that average over 500. I'm sorry, over 5 yards per carry. Again, that's a minimum of 300 attempts, and over 5 yards per reception, a minimum of 100 receptions in the regular season since 2022. Now he's got to stay on the field, but if he can start seeing more consistent touches, I think he does have a potential to finish as a top 5 running back this year. Bucky Irving, we saw what he really did, especially in the back half of the season for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I think that he can continue that this season. They have an improved offensive line. Hopefully Tristan Wirfs can get back in there at the left tackle spot. But even if Tristan Wirfs has to miss the first 4 games, if he remains on the PUP list, I still think that's he could still put together a good season, even if he's missing one of his best offensive linemen that's blocking for him, mainly because of his receiving ability. He can take a little dump off screen for 30 plus yards and turn that into a touchdown. Chase Brown really came on strong at the end of last year. I think he has an opportunity to explode. They got the offensive playmakers in Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. I think he's going to be that third guy that makes the offensive flow. In Cincinnati, they released Zach Moss. Now, they do have Taj Brooks and Samaje Perine as their backup options, but I'm expecting Chase Brown to dominate the touches and kind of continue that type of performance that we saw in the back half of last year. So that's why I'd be willing to take him. James Cook, maybe I could have had him in the previous tier I talked about. He was a guy that was actually in this tier for me last year, and that ended up proving true. We saw all those touchdowns that he got for Buffalo. But I just kept him in this tier just because he is kind of in that contract dispute right now with Buffalo. I don't think they're going to trade him regardless if they don't get a deal with him. But that's another thing that could benefit James Cook, is if they do not come to agreement on a contract extension before the season, he's going to want to ball out so he can go get a huge contract with Buffalo or somewhere else in the next offseason. Moving into this next tier. This next tier, what I'm calling it, is running backs that offer a high ceiling as an RB2 tier. So what I mean by this is, these are running backs I don't want to draft in my RB1 slot, but I would be willing to draft as my RB2, maybe my flex play. Maybe I can, depending on where these guys are going in your drafts, maybe I can draft them as a bench option and be patient and maybe start somebody in my RB2 spot. That's going to be, I will speak about in the next tier. And basically, these are players that I think do have the potential to be an RB1, but there might need to be patience, or something just all has to come together for them. With that being said, running backs that offer a high ceiling as an RB2 tier: Breece Hall, Ashton Jeanty, Omarion Hampton, and Travion Henderson. Starting with Breece Hall. He was a guy I took a shot on last year very high as my RB1. That didn't really work out for me, so that's why I slid him into this tier. And then we have the potential of Braylon Allen cutting into his touches. I still think if Braylon Allen cuts into his touches, Breece Hall can put together a great season. He's another guy that wants a contract extension. I think he said something in like a week or so that the New York doesn't really view him as that. So it sounds like he might not be getting that extension with the Jets. So something to keep in mind with Breece Hall too. If all this falls apart for New York this year, I'm not saying that there's no rumors about it, but maybe Hall gets moved to a better situation at the trade deadline. So that's something to keep in mind. With that being said, Breece Hall did actually pop up on my stats. That's why I still view him as a potential RB1 if the Jets offense can finally figure it out up there in New York. With that being said, Breece Hall is actually one of only 4 running backs in the NFL who have at least 2,300 rushing yards and 1,100 receiving yards in the regular season since 2022. The next stat, again, this is a minimum of 17 regular season games since 2022. He is one of only 3 running backs that average over 55 rushing yards per game and 30 receiving yards per game. So yeah, that's why I'm very high on him still as a potential RB1, but I would prefer to draft him as an RB2 on my rosters. Ashton Jeanty, right? Everything says that he should be an RB1. I try not to trust drafting rookie running backs into my RB1 slot. I would rather get a safer option as my RB1 and then maybe get an Ashton Genty as my RB2. But with that being said, he's a top 10 pick. I expect the Las Vegas Raiders to feed him the ball. He should get a plenty amount of touches, which also gives him a floor. But if he proves true to his talent that he showed at Boise State, he can eventually slide in as an RB1 at some point in the season. Omarion Hampton is a guy I am very high on as a rookie out of North Carolina for the Chargers. I think this kid has all the talent in the world to become a very successful running back. But, and let's go ahead and I'll talk about TreVeyon Henderson. I'm very high on TreVeyon Henderson as well. That kid has electric speed out of Ohio State. But with both those running backs, right? Now we'll have to see. I'll talk about Najee Harris in the next tier. And TreVeyon Henderson's got Ramondre Stevenson, right? So both these rookie running backs are dealing with a veteran running back that they're going to split touches, right? So these are two running backs that you might want to potentially, you could draft them as your RB2, but you might want to get like a safer option for your RB2 to start the beginning of the season. But I believe with both these running backs, once we start to reach the halfway point of the season, towards the back end of the season, that's when they're going to start taking majority of the touches and really explode. I remember like Jonathan Taylor's rookie season, who I forget who he was splitting touches with. I should know as a Colts fan, but he was kind of splitting touches, right, in the first half of the season, and then he overtook that RB1 role and exploded for the rest of his rookie season. So that's kind of how I think things could turn out for Omarion Hampton and TreVeyon Henderson. They offer a high ceiling as an RB2, but with these two rookie running backs, I would actually prefer maybe getting drafting a player I can trust at least in the first 4 to 8 weeks in my RB2 slot. Maybe I play these two guys in my flex or just stash them on the bench until they start seeing those consistent touches going forward. Moving into my next tier of running backs, these are guys maybe you could draft to have as your RB2, and then maybe you get a Hampton or Henderson in your flex or on your bench until those guys start to come on. These are running backs that I view that offer a high floor as an RB2. These are guys I think that you could, as long as you get your RB1, you can draft these guys as your RB2 and likely leave them there, or at least they can hold that spot until a guy with a high ceiling starts to come on and performs week in and week out. With that being said, these players, Alvin Kamara, Karen Williams, Tony Pollard, David Montgomery, James Conner, Aaron Jones, and Jordan Mason, Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet, DeAndre Swift, Ramondre Stevenson, Travis Etienne Jr., Isaiah Pacheco, Brian Robinson Jr., and Najee Harris. Guys that popped up on the stats are in the first two slots. Alvin Kamara. Now, I will say this. Honestly, I don't think I'm going to draft any Saints this year. I think I want to stay away from that offense, in my opinion. With that being said, though, I still think he's a high floor running back 2 option, especially because I think Alvin Kamara is a name to watch around the trade deadline, because I think the Saints are not going to be that good this year. Now, with that being said, he is one of 4 running backs that have at least 2,300 rushing yards and 1,100 receiving yards in the regular season since 2022. Again, the next stat is a minimum of 17 regular season games. He's one of the 3 running backs that average over 55 rushing yards per game and 30 receiving yards per game since 2022. And then Kieran Williams, he's actually one of 4 running backs in the NFL that have at least 15 regular season games where they finished with at least 75 plus rushing yards and a touchdown since 2022. Tony Pollard, just, he's going to get fed the ball there. I don't want these next few guys. I'm not going to really go into too much depth on them because otherwise this tier would take forever to go through. Same thing with David Montgomery. I mean, if something happened to Jahmyr Gibbs, where Jahmyr Gibbs did get hurt, David Montgomery could slide into an RB1 slot. Aaron Jones and Jordan Mason, they're going to split time there. So this might be a headache to deal with, to be honest, but I still feel safe that they're going to get touches because JJ McCarthy is basically playing as a rookie, and especially to at least begin the season, they're not going to want to put all the pressure on JJ McCarthy to deliver. So I expect them to try to feed the running game so that can feed into the play action for JJ McCarthy, which should benefit Aaron Jones and Jordan Mason. Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet. I'm a big Zach Charbonnet fan. I know people are also big Kenneth Walker fans. It depends on where you stand. I do like Kenneth Walker. He just does deal with injuries from time to time. But I feel like both those guys are good RB2 options. DeAndre Swift, he has the contract there in Chicago, so he's at least going to start the season and seeing those touches. Ideally, what he's going to be for that team is kind of what Jahmyr Gibbs was for Ben Johnson in Detroit, and he's going to make an impact in the receiving game, which can make him more valuable. Ramondre Stevenson, I actually talked more in depth about him in my top 5 running backs to target late in fantasy football drafts video. If you haven't seen that, go back and watch that video. I don't want to repeat everything I said about him in this video. Travis Etienne Jr., he's just a guy where he's actually entering a contract season, so maybe that could benefit him to put together a season. I'm going to talk about Tank Bigsby here in a moment. But Travis Etienne Jr., with that being said, he's another guy to watch around the trade deadline. He could potentially get moved to a better situation as well, where maybe he's going to go to a playoff team if they need running back health because of injuries. Isaiah Pacheco, he's going to be healthy this year. We saw what he's done for Kansas City in the past, and I do feel safe as drafting him as my RB2. Brian Robinson Jr. is not going to he doesn't really offer a high ceiling as a player, but he should be getting fed a healthy amount of touches. Austin Eckler's up there in age, right? So he should be dominating the touches in Washington. And then as far as Najee Harris, he got that eye injury, right, from the fireworks. So I don't know he hasn't practiced yet at training camp. So we'll have to kind of see if he's even going to have an opportunity to start the season. But if he starts practicing in the next coming weeks, I do kind of expect him to kind of dominate the touches over Hampton, at least in the first 4 to 8 weeks. That's why I view him as a safe RB2 option to start the season. But I do, like I mentioned earlier with Hampton, I think Hampton's going to end up dominating the touches. So if you do get Najee Harris as an RB2, you're going to want to maybe get a high ceiling guy or have a plan in place, because at some point Hampton's going to dominate those touches in Los Angeles. My next tier of players, these are like top handcuff running back tiers. These are handcuffs of some of the guys I spoke about in my RB1 status and some of the handcuffs in my RB2 status. I'm just going to run down this list and kind of mention who they're tied to. Braylon Allen is tied obviously to Breece Hall. I did talk about Braylon Allen in my top 5 running backs to target late video. Please go back and watch that. And it sounds like in training camp it is kind of coming true, where Aaron Glenn does kind of want to utilize Breece Hall in the Jahmyr Gibbs role and Braylon Allen in the David Montgomery role. He's kind of potentially sliding into an RB2 flex play if he sees consistent touches. Tank Bigsby's kind of in a similar status, right? He's based on reports coming out of Jacksonville. He's kind of starting to work in more with the RB1 offense. But I think with Allen and Bigsby, even though we're getting these reports, right, where these players are kind of starting to work into the offense, until we get to the regular season and I see that as an option, I'd rather draft them as a handcuff on my bench and then put them in my lineup. I don't really want to draft them as an RB2 or flex play. Tyjae Spears, a guy I'm very high on in Tennessee. He's a guy I talked about my top 5 running backs. Obviously, he's tied to Tony Pollard. I don't want to repeat everything. If I mentioned my top 5 running backs to target late video, that's just because I don't want to repeat everything I've said, and because I do have my consistent listeners. But if you have not watched that video yet, please go back and watch that. Same thing with Trey Benson. He's in that video. He's tied to James Conner. Obviously, if you draft Christian McCaffrey, you're going to want to probably draft Isaac Guerendo. Obviously, we want Christian McCaffrey to stay healthy this season, but obviously coming off that injury, he's older in age. If you do draft Christian McCaffrey, you're probably going to want to stash Isaac Guerendo as a safe option on your bench. Tyler Algiers tied to Bijan Robinson if you end up drafting Bijan Robinson as your RB1. Rachaad White is tied to Bucky Irving, so you maybe want to get both those guys on your rosters just in case something happens to Irving. Roschon Johnson's a guy I kind of been keeping my eye on in his first couple years in the NFL. Just hasn't came together, but he's tied to DeAndre Swift. It sounds like he's been looking good at camp in Chicago. So if you do get a DeAndre Swift, you may want to consider a Roschon Johnson on your bench. Austin Eckler is tied to Brian Robinson Jr. I'll be curious to see how the backfield would look if Brian Robinson Jr. got hurt, because I know Austin Eckler is still a performer, but he is kind of getting up there in the age. I don't know if he's going to be able to take the bell cow work, but he still is a premium handcuff for the Commanders. Ray Davis made some plays right for the Buffalo Bills, so he's tied with James Cook as a top handcuff. Again, I don't think they're going to trade James Cook, right, because he wants that contract extension, but you never know. What if they did, and all of a sudden Ray Davis slides up in fantasy value? Justice Hill is tied to Derrick Henry. Obviously, Derrick Henry is proven to stay healthy, but if anything unfortunately happened to him and you drafted him as your RB1, you're going to want to at least have Justice Hill as a backup option if you don't have quality depth. Jalen Wright is tied to Devin Achane. Obviously, Achane's a smaller back. Hopefully, he can stay healthy for all 17 games this year. But if you're going to take a chance on a Devin Achane as your RB1, like I will in some drafts, you may want to have Jalen Wright as your backup option. Raheem Mostert, right? He's a guy that's always been relatively fancy value because of injuries or whatnot, and he had his little run down there in Miami. But if you're unaware, he is with the Las Vegas Raiders now, so he's actually tied to Ashton Jeanty. So if anything unfortunately happens to Ashton Jeanty, Raheem Mostert would be the running back you'd probably want in Las Vegas. And then Kareem Hunt, we saw what he did when Isaiah Pacheco was sidelined with injuries last year. So if you do get Isaiah Pacheco as your RB2, if you do want to handcuff that, Kareem Hunt would be your guy. Moving into the last tier, basically these are running backs that I want to stash on my bench tier. What does that mean? These are guys that I'm not trying to draft as an RB2. I'm not trying to draft these guys as an RB3. Majority of this list, besides the top two names you're seeing, it's going to be like a running back by committee type of situation with those respective teams, or those two players are going to probably be splitting the most touches in the backfield. So I don't really want to draft these guys to be my starters, but I'd be willing to take a chance on them on my bench and seeing if one of these guys end up taking a majority of the touches for their team and seeing if they can slide into a flex play or an RB2 play. Now, that top name, Joe Mixon with Nick Chubb. Joe Mixon, if he wasn't dealing with this foot injury, he probably would have been in my RB2 with a high floor tier. But if you guys are unaware, he's dealing with a foot injury, and I think this foot, if I understand it right, this foot injury is going to kind of he's not practicing, and I think it's going to be up to the regular season as far as if he's going to be available. So if a running back with a foot injury that's 29 years old, I'm not trying to draft him to be a potential starter. Now, if he falls well below his ADP and I can stash him on his bench and that foot injury is just put behind him and he can perform like he did last year, that's a steal on my bench. But I've always been a big fan of Nick Chubb. We'll have to see if Nick Chubb can finally return to what he looked like prior to breaking his leg. So that's why I wouldn't mind stashing Nick Chubb too, because if Joe Mixon foot injury does carry into the regular season, he never gets 100% healthy, and also Nick Chubb is the old Nick Chubb, that can be a heck of a steal. Really quick, I also don't think people really understand how productive Joe Mixon has been over the last 3 years. He actually popped up in one of those stats I was doing earlier. Joe Mixon is actually one of the only 4 running backs in the NFL who have at least 2,300 rushing yards and 1,100 receiving yards in the regular season since 2022. These next 3 running backs, Chuba Hubbard, Rico Dowdle, and Trevor Etienne, those are the running backs in Carolina. Obviously, Chuba Hubbard has that contract, but then they signed Rico Dowdle, who was a good solid fantasy option last year, and they drafted Trevor Etienne, who I was a very big fan of. He's Travis Etienne Jr.'s younger brother. So I think Hubbard and Dowdle are more stash options. Trevor Etienne, he'd be like in a super deep league stash option. He would probably be on the waivers if he ends up having a role. But I just listed Etienne there because I'm a fan of him. But Hubbard and Dowdle would be the running backs that you would want to stash from Carolina on your bench and then see who ends up dominating the touches in the regular season. J.K. Dobbins was great until he got hurt for the Chargers. He signed with the Denver Broncos, and they got the rookie running back out of UCF, R.J. Harvey. So those are going to be the 2 running backs to stash on your bench from the Denver Broncos, is just to kind of see how this situation plays out in the regular season. With the Pittsburgh Steelers, they got Jalen Jaylen Warren. But my thing with Warren is I don't know if he can take the bell cow of the role. But they also have the rookie running back out of Iowa, Caleb Johnson. So those would be the two running backs that you would want to stash on your bench and take a chance on and see who ends up dominating the touches and may become fantasy relevant out of the Steelers. We saw Tyron Tracy Jr. really come on as a fantasy option last year, but then they drafted my boy out of Arizona State, Cam Scadaboo, so I'm a big fan of him. And they still got Devin Singletary there. I kind of think this is going to be a running back by committee type of approach for the New York Giants. I don't really feel safe drafting any of them. But I mean, Tracy Jr. did prove himself, right? He'd probably be the guy to stash first, then maybe a Cam Scadaboo. Cam Scadaboo and Singletary. I mean, people probably will draft Scadaboo because of his playoff run. Singletary would probably be a waiver option in the season, but those are the names to watch if you're looking for a potential fantasy relevant player out of New York. And then in Dallas, you see I got Jaden Blue there first, but it's probably going to be Javonte Williams and Miles Sanders that start the year dominating the touches. Jaden Blue is the rookie running back out of Texas. I think has a super high ceiling as a player, especially with his receiving ability. This kid has like elite speed. I'm a very big fan of what this kid could do. I don't know if he's going to end up taking majority of the touches in Dallas, but I saw some reports he started getting work with the starters this past week, and he was looking pretty good. Again, I think all three running backs are going to kind of just split the touches in Dallas, but would be the three names to maybe stash on the bench, and then maybe if by week 8, maybe one of them start dominating like 70% of the touches, especially in PPR leagues, if Blue can really start working into the passing attack, maybe he can become fantasy relevant for you. And then Dylan Sampson, the last three running backs, these are the three running backs just to monitor in Cleveland. I talked about Dylan Sampson and my top 5 running backs to target late. I'm a big fan of that kid's game. They also do got Jerome Ford, and then I don't know if Quinshon Judkins is going to end up playing football this year, but I still have him listed because he hasn't been officially ruled out because of that domestic assault. So yeah, that was a pretty long video for you guys today. I mean, there's so many running backs in the NFL, but yeah, if you guys enjoyed that video, please hit the like button. If you have not subscribed to my YouTube channel, please hit subscribe. Also follow me on all my social media platforms. You can follow me on X. That's where I'm the most active. I do have an Instagram account. That's more personal shares I do on there. And I do cut up my YouTube videos and post them on my TikTok as well. My next video will be my wide receiver tier video. I'm shooting to hopefully get that out to you guys by Tuesday evening. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoy your weekend. I'll talk to you soon. Peace out.